Hello and welcome to Com619 Devops. This is session 5. Just a quick recap, just to remind us of what we've actually done so far. In the first week we looked a bit back at JSPs in previous course you did last year. Then in session 2 we looked at how to build a leaflet app that can place points on a map. Then we looked in session 3 at how to manage user accounts and how to set up user roles, basically having users that are anonymous, users who are actually logged in, and users who are super users or administrators who can manage all of the other users. Then last week, session 4, we looked at internationalization and how to add that into a simple JSP based app. This week I'm going to look at basic authentication of REST APIs. And we remember in session 2 we looked at the REST API that had been used with the leaflet app, and we also looked at Swagger and the Swagger UI to be able to exercise that. Now we're looking at how to secure that using basic authentication. So I'll just say briefly before I go any further that you really do have pretty much everything you need in order to complete the assessment now from a programming perspective. Now you still need to do the DevOps side, which is the continuous integration and deployment in a server, but again you should have enough material to allow you to do that. The trick now is as a team to bring all of this together, to allocate tasks to different members of your team so that some people could work on the internationalization, some people could work on the basic application itself, and you can split the work up and allow different people to work on different parts and then bring the work together as a unified whole. I'll talk again with your teams in class to see how well you're doing with that, but by now we should be in a place where you've got everything you need to be able to do that part of the assessment, and you should be well ahead with that. If you haven't really started yet, then I am getting increasingly worried because basically you're leaving it very late to get going with this. So with all that said, let's look at session 5. And under session 5 you'll see a basic description of authentication. Now the simplest form of authentication you can have in a web app is basic authentication, and by basic authentication we mean that we include within the actual headers of the HTML request that's sent a header, and basically headers are basically name value pairs. A header with the name, authorization, and then the value begins with basic, and then you have a string which is actually a base 64 encoded version of the username and the password. So if the username and password were global admin, then the string you would get would be this string here, and that would be included within the basic authorization request. And you can see an example here using curl where that is done. Now if I show you what I've done on the application to show you how this works, then I'll go into the code. So as always, I've actually got the application running here. Let me just show you again how to get that going. Now I'm actually in session 5 user management example web, and of course what you would do is maven clean install to actually oh dear, sorry, badly spelt, to actually compile the application. I think during the compilation process it will run several tests, and we'll see that happening in a minute. Now this is exactly the same application as you had previously in session 3. The only difference is I've added in a REST API, and I will show you that in a second. So once it's finished its compile and its tests, we shall do a Spring Boot run. which should spin up the application. There we go. So the application is now running, and if I go to the web page, obviously in 8080, you'll see global admin and user are the pre-encoded users, but you can add extra users. I'm just going to copy this username and password and go to the home page. And if you remember, it was a basic home page with not a lot of information on it. Log in. And we're now logged in. Now the difference here is that I have the ability to manage users, which we had previously. You can add a user, you can modify a user, but I also have the ability to open a Swagger UI, which gets me access to a very simple API that only allows me to get user information. So I'm going to go after get user list, and if I try it out, execute, you can see that it's coming back with forbidden. Well, why is that? Well, the reason is that we haven't included any basic authentication in the request. So in order to do that, I need to use this authorize button. Now we'll have to make some changes to our code to actually get this authorize button to show up, but when it does show up, we can click on it and we can put in our global admin username and password, click authorize, and now that authorization will be used with every request that's made. So again, now if I do an execute, what I get back is 200, which means it's a fine, it's okay, but I also get back the actual information, user 1, user 2, so that's working fine. Okay, I'll just add on to this actually that I've sent back the user and the user has come back with a hashed password. Now in a real API that would actually be a serious security issue. You really don't want to be sending out the hashed password with any requests for user information. You can see the password here is clearly blank. That's because the user object never fills in the password, it only ever fills in the hash password. I'll leave it to your own imagination to work out how to get rid of that hash password, but in your own application it's important that you never send that out. So you would basically null that before you included it in the value that's sent out. Anyway, that's enough of that. That's what the application looks like. How did we actually make this work? Well, let's have a look at the code. So this is the actual code. I'm going to go into COM619 Devops, Session5, User Management Web, Java Resources, and all of this code is exactly the same as it was before, except that there are two extra classes in here. One is this auth OpenAPI customizer, and one is the user REST controller, and there is actually a user authorized service as well. Okay, so very quickly, what does the auth OpenAPI customizer do? We double click on that and open it up. All this actually does is it adds extra information into the OpenAPI Swagger definition that basically says we're going to be used basic authentication. And if I go back to the web page and you see authorize, if you actually look at the API docs, that authorize basically generates that. That is all that is required to go into the API documentation, which is obviously done in JSON. If that basic authorization is in there, then whenever you render up the web UI, then it will include that authorize button. But to get that into the auth API docs, you have to, as I saw previously, include this extra bit of information that customizes the Open API. So I just give that to you. Again, you can go and look at the documentation, but if you just use that class, the class is automatically loaded because it's annotated as a component. It will just work if you put it in the right place. Okay, so that's the first thing. Then the second thing is, let's look at the user REST controller. Now, we saw REST controllers before. In this case, it's very, very simple. We've got two REST calls. One is get user list, and the other is get user. I've also included this simple operation here, which get a list of all users. That is what generates in the Swagger UI a definition. So get user list, get list of all users. That documentation there comes from this annotation here. And there are many other annotations you can add to make a much richer interface description, but that's all they do. They just add information into the interface rendering. They don't actually change the API itself. The API is defined by the request mapping, which is /getUserList. Now, what happens after that? Well, when the web server receives the request and sends it to Spring, it also sends the actual raw request object, which is what has come in from the web browser. Now, that raw request object contains the user information. So what I can do is get information out of that HTTP request and find out who has actually made the basic authorization. And I'm doing that using this user authorization service. So let's have a look at the user authorization service. Now, this is a very simple class. Again, it's wired up as a component, so everywhere you've got auto wired in it, this component can be wired in. This particular component uses the user repository, and you basically, when you want to get the authorized user role, you give it the HTTP request, and it sends you back the user role associated with the user. If the user can't be found, it sends back anonymous, so we'll always have a user role coming back, but it will be anonymous if it isn't actually one of the other user roles that we have defined for the user. So what do? Well, first of all, we look for the request authorization header, and that gives us just the string that corresponds to authorization. We then basically extract the basic part of it because we don't need that. We just need to know that it is basic authorization. Other types of authorization are possible, OAuth and tokens and things like that. We just want to use basic. Okay, so we find out that we start off with basic, and that means that we just need to extract the username and password. We then get the base 64 credentials. So first thing is get rid of the basic, trim that off. Then we use the base 64 decoder to decode those credentials. And what we get back is a string that basically will look like username and password. What we then do is we split that string around the colon so that we've got the username and the password in two separate values. Now that we have the username, we can look up that username in the user repository. If the user repository doesn't give me back that username, then I throw an exception saying unauthenticated username. I just don't know who this person is. If I do get the username, then the next thing I do is I check that the password is correct. And remember that in the user code, there is an ability to check the password hash. So we're never actually sending the password to the database. We're checking that when we hash the password, we get the same hash that is in the database. If it isn't correct, then we throw another runtime exception. But if it is correct, then we send back the user role associated with that. And if anything goes wrong in all of this, we just throw another exception saying problem decoding credentials. So that's all that we're doing within this class. We are extracting the username and password, and we're checking if we know who the username is. And if we do, then we check the password, and if it's correct, we send back the credentials associated with that username. So it'll be anonymous, or it could be global admin, or it could be just a user, depending on the credentials. If I just go to the user, just to show you again how that decoding's been done. Under user, you can see that we have is valid password. And what it does is it uses this password utils class to check the password against the hashed password. And if it's correct, then it'll reply true, but if it isn't correct, then it'll reply false. So that's just how that's being done. Okay, so that basically is everything you need to know. When we look back at the REST controller, you can see that we receive the request and we look up and see, are we an administrator? If we are an administrator, then we can send back the user repository find all information. But if we are not an administrator, then we throw another response status exception. We're sending back forbidden, and we're sending back unauthorized request. Basically what that particular exception will do is it will turn into a proper HTTP response with code 401. But if it comes back correct, it'll come back with an HTTP response 200, which is okay. And the same thing happens with the get user. The only difference here being is that we're finding by username, and the username is included as a request parameter within the request. And if we aren't an administrator, we throw an error, but if we are an administrator, then we return the response. Subtle change to this could be, you might say that if I am the user who is asking for the get user information, then I might be willing to respond with the user information, but only if I'm logged in as that user. In that case, you'd modify this slightly so that you could check that the user is actually allowed to access that information before you send the information back. But I will leave that to your imagination how to do this. Now this is just showing you how to get information out of a REST API. You will obviously be changing the REST API that you have for the leaflet application in order to allow you to upload images and new points on the map, and you will want to authenticate that in a similar way as we are doing here. Final thing to say is that this stuff here, user authorized service and the REST authorization, it's doing it in a correct way, but it's showing you all of the underlying details of how this works. There is a technology called Spring Security which does all of this for you, so you wouldn't have to write all of this boilerplate code. It already is included in the library. I'm not using Spring Security in any of these examples because I didn't want to complicate it for you too much. This will work and will be sufficient for you in the assessment. If you want to use Spring Security, lots of tutorials are available, and next week I will probably show you some of this application running using that. But I wanted to take it a step at a time so that you understand what's going on rather than just taking it for granted that it all works, which is nice, but doesn't teach you an awful lot. Okay, hopefully that was sufficient for you to understand how it's working. If I just go back to the main application again and remind you that if we wanted, for instance, to use get user and I wanted to try it out, I would put in, in this case, global admin as username, execute that, and with a bit of luck, we will actually get back just the user who is the global admin and not the full user list, because I'm searching for that. And you can see the search, in this case the username is global admin. That's what's being sent to the browser. I will show you one other thing because this is useful. I mentioned it in the notes. It's something called RESTer. And RESTer is an extension for, in this case I'm using it with Firefox, but you can also use it with Chrome as a plugin. There are alternatives to this, but I find RESTer is simple and standalone. Some of the other alternatives require you to have a login to a site, which I think is a bit intrusive to what we need to do. Let me see if I can find COM619. So these are my examples. In my get user list example, I basically I'm making the call to get the user, and if I send that, first thing to say is let's look at the headers. There's no headers. Let's look at the authorization. No authorization has been set up. So if I send that as it stands, I will get back a 403 response, forbidden, if I try and get user. If I set the administration, so I'm just going to remove that, and I'm going to add another authorization token. Generate a new token. So here I'm just going to put in, I shall just call it basic. Doesn't matter what it's called, it just keeps it in the application. Global admin, save that. And now I'm going to use the basic global admin, and if I send that, you will see we've got a response back with which we expect. And if you look at the headers, you'll see that that header has been created for you automatically as part of that authorization work. So you can do posts, gets, requests, patch, anything you want with this. It's a very useful little application to help you build your requests and test your web app manually based on the information that you've been given. Okay, with that I will end. Thank you very much for your attention, and obviously you can ask questions in class. Thank you and goodbye.